So when we talk about Rousseau, we are talking about three registers. We're talking about three registers. So let me maybe write this here. So if we imagine that this is time, and this is some measure of goodness. So G for good. How good life is, how good people are. Whatever you mean by the word good, which is a separate question, hard to define, but let's start somewhere. We need to keep in mind that, again, for Rousseau, we start from this state of nature. And this is where we get what Rousseau calls the savage. Then we proceed to talk about the evil contract. So there are two social contracts in Rousseau. So there's basically we're going to be reading two texts. One is the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and the other one is of the social contract. So, and he will be describing certain kinds of social contracts if you want, and these are different social contracts. So yeah. So we have savage here. Then, very importantly, below zero, we have the bourgeois. Bourgeois is a word that actually Rousseau uses. It comes from the Germanic root burg or something like that, borough in English, right? Which means city or town. So bourgeois is a town dweller, and it is Rousseau who coins this phrase bourgeois as a pejorative term, and Marx will later take this from Rousseau. Well, again, I'm not sure if Rousseau the one. Well, anyway, to oversimplify, and then you have the citizen. And this refers to the state of nature. This refers to the evil contract. Now, evil contract is not a phrase that Rousseau uses, but it is a phrase that the study guide uses. Therefore, we're going to be using this phrase. Again, when you write this on the University of London exam, make sure you signal to the examiners that you understand that this is not the phrase that Rousseau uses, right? The so-called evil contract, or some interpreters call this evil contract. And then we have the true social contract. True social contract. And these are three distinct registers. So it is crucially important to keep this distinction in mind whenever you talk about Rousseau. So any question you want to ask about Rousseau, what about love, or marriage, or childbearing, or censorship, or conscription, or elections, or property? Jean-Jacques, are these good things or bad things? Is property a good thing or a bad thing? Is conscription a good thing or a bad thing? Is censorship a good thing or a bad thing? Before you can answer the question, you have to specify where do you exist? Which place are we talking about? Bourgeois censorship and bourgeois conscription are horrible, and why is this below zero? Because you're better off dead than being a bourgeois. Rousseau is very clear on this point. But if you live in a true social contract, yes, then censorship is fine, it's acceptable. And conscription is also, I don't want to say a wonderful thing, but certainly something that, conscription is something that a true citizen should be enthusiastic about. We'll talk about this, hopefully, in a bit. Anyway, so again, let's keep this picture in mind. It's a very important starting position for us. Again, so you see, people like to draw this, a table, say, there's Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and what do they say about state of nature and the social contract? And this seems to be a big misunderstanding because Rousseau is talking in a very different fashion. And when you try to compare the contract of Hobbes and Locke to Rousseau, you have to specify which contract do you mean. Anyway, and not to mention that again, state of nature is also somewhat different. So be careful about straightforward comparisons, even though the study guide actually invites you to do something like that. Okay, so I suppose let's begin at the beginning. Let's begin with the hypothetical state of nature. So the state of nature, if you want, is a hypothetical reconstruction. Well, again, so Rousseau means this as a real historical epoch. So but we do not have direct empirical access to this historical epoch. So he's doing a hypothetical reconstruction of a real historical epoch. So let me maybe write this on the board. So it's a hypothetical reconstruction of a real historical epoch. By the way, let me correct a mistake I've made. This line should be like this. Why? Because this movement has already happened and is guaranteed by history. But this upward motion is conditional. It's not inevitable. Not all societies have to move upwards in this direction, and not all of them will. Not to mention that for Rousseau, as for Hobbes, no society will exist forever. For Rousseau and for Hobbes, society, like a human being, at some point will die. And Rousseau says even the best societies, and the examples for Rousseau are Roman Republic and Sparta, and maybe some other examples. If mighty Sparta has fallen, no society can hope to last forever. Okay, so we start with this hypothetical reconstruction. And when Rousseau was talking about this hypothetical reconstruction, you cannot go and look at the state of nature, but he will take his bearing from looking at children, animals, and indigenous tribes, so primitive people. So let me write indigenous populations. Now, all of this sort of, I don't know, with a question mark, because children are not in the state of nature, animals are not in the state of nature, indigenous tribes are not in the state of nature. But you can look at them and use them to reconstruct some hypothetical, this hypothetical notion of the state of nature. So in the state of nature, again, this is a hypothetical reconstruction of a real condition. It really did take place as far as Rousseau can tell. So in the state of nature, there's a bunch of things which are missing. So there is no, I don't know, first of all, no society, no property, no families, no language, and no scarcity. And maybe something else I'm forgetting. Yeah, so no scarcity, no language, no families, no society, no property. Yeah, I suppose these are the ones I want to talk about. So when we get this on the board, for Rousseau the idea is that, look, I mean, Rousseau is writing before Darwin, but he imagines that the species evolve. And he says, if we look at the animals do not have language. So he says, we have to imagine that at some point, human beings have acquired language. Human beings have invented language, if you want. And this had taken place at some point in history. So when he talks about the state of nature, he wants to go before that. Now, if we try to map Rousseau's story on our contemporary accounts of how contemporary anthropologists think this has worked, it's complicated, right? Because strictly speaking, before language, we're probably not talking about Homo sapiens. We're talking about some primitive primates, maybe apes, or maybe even before that. Who knows? It's a complicated story. So what I'm trying to say is that Rousseau is unaware of contemporary biology, and so his story cannot really be mapped onto our contemporary understanding of human genetic evolution in a straightforward fashion. So we have to be careful. But at the same time, I will argue that when we talk about the state of nature, Rousseau's account of the state of nature is actually most in line with our contemporary understanding of anthropology. So he's the closest to our contemporary understanding of anthropology, but at the same time there are discrepancies, and we'll talk about them in a second. So in the state of nature, we want to talk about the human characteristics in the state of nature. And the human characteristics in the state of nature, the two most important ones are... yes.
So if Rousseau says that first there was nothing, as language kills the bonds of the societies which are formed by families, so that acquire property, therefore there is still a state of scarcity. But if he says that none of this existed, can we kind of consider him an atheist? Because I know that we can't, because that's one of the reasons that he was abolished from his society, and because he was considered an atheist, but he's not. So how does he challenge his state of nature in regards to God? And,
Okay, yeah,
so
this is actually a complicated question.
First there was God.
Well, I would say that same as with many other thinkers we talk about in this course. Like for the first three, like if you imagine we have 4 seminars. First 3 seminars, you imagine that Rousseau is an atheist. Seminar number 4, you start asking these questions. It depends very much. It very much depends on how do you define what is atheism and what is theism. There are some definitions of atheism and theism on which Bertrand Russell is not an atheist.
No, I mean, like with Hobbes, it's clear that he says that yes, God made this exist, but my accountants of the social bonding and how the society has been organized starts with the state of nature, which regards this, this, and that. With Locke, it's also clear that God created everything, God is the sovereign, so we all have to obey the sovereign for God. And then in this case, the state of nature, like chronologically, where does it start from? Not in the particular date, but which epoch, which hypothetical epoch is he referring to?
Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, clearly, God is not as important for Rousseau as for other thinkers. So, like, as for Locke, let's say. So you can imagine that Rousseau, like Hobbes, starts without God. I mean, God doesn't play any particular role. And I wasn't planning to write God on the board anywhere. Now, when exactly does this take place? We are talking about something like human beings, but let's say before these things develop. So it's like right before society, property, families, and very importantly language, before these things start to develop, you have these proto-humans. This is what we're talking about. So like, I cannot give you a date, but counting backwards, as soon as you get to the position where like, rewinding backwards in time, as soon as people lose all of this, these proto-humans is what you're looking for. Okay, let me continue, because I don't want to, these are complicated questions. Maybe, if something comes up, let's return to this, but let me continue with the story, and then we'll see. No, it's okay. That's questions of God and religion are complicated questions in Rousseau. There's a whole separate chapter about religion, and Rousseau is very much anti-Catholic, but is he an anti-Christian? That's a complicated story. I don't want to get there. Rousseau is a huge fan of civic religion and of, to some extent, of pagan religions of ancient Rome and Greece. Anyway, we'll get there, maybe. Maybe today, maybe at a later point. Anyway, so in the state of nature, so basically, when Rousseau is talking about this, he imagines the human beings in an animal-like condition. So whenever I talk about this, I'm always tempted to give comparisons to my cat. As you know, I have the world's leading expert on animal psychology because I have 2 cats and a dog. So obviously I'm entitled to talk about this. But yeah, I mean, whenever I discuss Rousseau, I'm tempted to talk about my cat to give it as an example. And we'll get there in a second. So in a sense that you imagine these humans, proto-humans, in relative isolation, just roaming around in the forest. And of course, obviously, the males and females, so a male and a female will come together, copulate, and then just separate. And the male does not take care of the children, as cats do, as stray cats do in the streets of Moscow. Male goes his way, and then the female is stuck with a child, and the female is attached to the child by the bonds of natural feeling, right? Natural, instinctual feeling of care for the child. And while the child is young, the mother takes care of it. As soon as the child can fend for itself, then they just separate. Same way as cats do in the streets of Moscow. So this is so there is some interaction between members of the species, but it's very limited. And by and large, they just disperse and they do not interact, except on rare and limited occasions. Okay, so the 2 most important characteristics of human beings in the state of nature. The first one is Amour de soi. This is a phrase in French. Why? Because amour de soi means love of self, self-love. Samolubia, something like that, right? Trouble is, Rousseau has another word, which is amour propre, which means the same thing, if you translate it. But it has a different connotation. So we have to use two different words of French language to separate the two. So you have amour de soi, which is your natural desire to feel good. And if I'm not mistaken, it's also a source of pity. Can I say that amour de soi is a source of pity, or should I just write this separately? Yeah, okay, let's write this separately. Okay, so in addition to this, humans have natural compassion. Natural, limited compassion. Natural, limited compassion, which again Rousseau in French calls pitié, or pity. The last one is perfectibility. Perfectibilité in French. And I suppose let's add here. We're talking about this relative isolation. Relative isolation. That human beings are relatively isolated from one another. Okay, so these are the three characteristics. So 1, 2, 3. So, well, maybe let's continue the story, and then I'll explain what these things mean, right? So again, you have this animal-like existence in the state of nature, and it is relatively harmonious. It's not the best that human beings can achieve, but it's pretty good. So immediately you have this question. Why do people leave the state of nature? For Hobbes, there's an answer. Because the state of nature is horrible. For Locke, there's an answer. Because the state of nature is inconvenient. What is the answer for Rousseau? Ask yourself this question. Do you remember from last year? Why do people leave the state of nature? Anybody venture to try and tell us? Easy to use. In what sense easy? But easier to live in society than in the state of nature.
Just because of this perfectibility, because of the historical movement.
This is actually exactly right. But notice, people leave the state of nature not because they want to leave the state of nature. The state of nature is wonderful and harmonious. You do not want to leave the state of nature. The historical circumstances change and they force you to leave the state of nature. This is the best condition that man can hope to achieve, barring the true social contract. But again, I'll return back to this. But this condition of the citizen of the true social contract, it's hypothetical. Let me write this here on the board. It's hypothetical. It is possible to achieve, but very difficult to achieve. And the vast majority of people will never live in the true social contract. The vast majority of people will be trapped in this evil contract. And vast majority of people, Rousseau says this very explicitly in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. The vast majority of people on planet Earth are better off dead. It's a very dramatic statement on Rousseau's part. So if we could, we would prefer to go back to the state of nature. Trouble is we cannot, for many reasons. Well, one reason is because the abundance and the freedom of the state of nature is no longer available to us because there are too many people and the land is already occupied. We cannot live as hunter-gatherers anymore. Because there are no free forests for you to roam through. All the forests belong to somebody who will protect them with the force of arms.
But then why is there no scarcity?
In the state of nature, there is no scarcity. Today there is scarcity, but in the state of nature, there was no scarcity. We'll get there. Don't worry. So this is actually going to be my next step. So let me continue on to my next step. So my next step is what happens in the state of nature. Well, this is a weird tradition, but I will probably follow this tradition. I'm going to start with -1. Now I will start with -1 because usually people say that there are 3 reasons why people leave the state of nature. Does that sound right? Should we start with -1? Or stop screwing around and start with 1. I don't know. Okay, let's start with -1 and see how it goes. So we start with -1. We start with -1 because population begins to increase. Now, immediately, so this is Rousseau, the sociologist. This is the structural analysis. Something happens to human beings not because they freely choose to, but because circumstances change structurally, for structural reasons which are beyond human control. So why does the population increase? Well, the answer to this question for Rousseau is human beings are just so good, so skillful at acquiring resources, if you want. It says that human beings lack instincts of other animals. We cannot run as fast or climb as high. We don't have sharp claws or teeth. But human beings, being masters of no trade, are jacks of all trades. You know this phrase. Right? Jack of all trades is a master of none. Yeah, so human beings are jacks of all trade, but masters of none. But this malleability, this ability to not be the fastest, but be moderately skillful in everything. This gives human beings competitive advantage. And just because human beings are so skillful, we grow in number. And as we grow in number, what happens is that human beings are forced to live together. They're forced. They cannot roam through the forest anymore. They're forced to live in close quarters just because there are so many of them. And here you have the emergence of families and tribes. So people are forced to live in close quarters, in close proximity to one another. And this is where something happens. Let me maybe write this here. So again, population increases, and then point 0 you have the emergence of families and tribes. Because here, in some sense, this is possibly the most important point. You have the emergence of a new sentiment, a new feature of human nature. And this is what Rousseau calls Amour propre. So this is Amour de soi and this is Amour propre. Both of them in French mean love of oneself. But they're different. So there are many ways to explain this. The simplest way is this. Animals have a natural desire to not suffer, to feel good. But this desire is limited and it is satiable. It's possible to satiate this desire. Imagine if you have a pet. Imagine your cat. Wakes up in the morning, takes a little stroll through your flat, has something to eat, and then just goes back to the couch and sleeps there. The cat is fine. It doesn't want anything anymore. Once it has taken a stroll and has eaten, it's fine. It's satisfied. So this desire is limited, and that's one of the reasons why there is no scarcity in the state of nature. Trouble is, Amour propre is a different desire. Amour propre is a desire which is related to our desire to be esteemed by others, to be seen in a certain way. So this is a desire to feel good. This is a desire to impress others, if you want. Impress others. This is a desire to be glorified. Glory-seeking animals, like in Hobbes. There's a deep similarity between what Rousseau is saying and what Hobbes had said. So if I just want to be satisfied, if I want to satisfy the needs of my body, like hunger and thirst, it doesn't cost very much to do so, right? So if you imagine some kind of hypothetical scenario, like how much, like I want to have lunch, and I want this lunch to be really good. I want it to be tasty. I want it to be healthy, free of carcinogens, free of poisonous or radioactive elements. How much can a lunch cost? Well, maybe $100, maybe $200. Let's make sure that everything is organic. Okay, let's say for the sake of the experiment, $1,000. Probably less. But let's say what I'm trying to say is that there's an upper limit. So if you want to satisfy your amour de soi, your lunch costs a limited amount. Trouble is that if you are pursuing this amour propre, if you're trying to impress others, how much can your lunch cost? Can you imagine somebody buying a hamburger for $1 million just to impress others? I can. In fact, I'm vaguely reminded of something like that. There was some kind of meat of an endangered shark or something which was sold on auction for $1 million, something like that. So basically, so in terms of amour de soi, this is limited. It's limited. In terms of amour propre, it's unlimited. And you can apply this to anything. If you want to take a pair of shoes, or if you want to build yourself a house, from the standpoint of utility, from the standpoint of something that you can get out of it, the price of anything is limited, always. But if you're trying to impress others, if I want to have a pair of shoes such that everybody in the room will drop their pants and drool over my shoes or something like that, yes, there is no upper limit. There is no upper limit on how much this can cost. And this, similar to Hobbes, this will lead to scarcity. Again, it's an interesting question. Does amour propre, does it appear here? Or is amour propre always a part of human condition and it gets activated? Short answer, not important. Although those of you who are going to be writing about Rousseau on the University 1 exam will talk about this issue. Yeah, let's leave it to a later seminar. So again, this is what are these points here on the board? This is the story of how we leave the state of nature. How we leave the state of nature. How we're forced to leave the state of nature. As population increases, families, tribes. Here we get amour propre. And in addition to amour propre, sort of simultaneously, we get wheat and iron. Or, you understand, metallurgy and agriculture. And,
So before you said that people don't want to leave the state of nature, and that's where amour de soi comes in, when you just want to fulfill your basic everyday desires. But then you also said that hence people don't want to leave the state of nature. It's the historical events that make them to do so. But then, which historical event or what could possibly trigger the emergence of amour propre?
yeah, this is exactly what Rousseau says in the discourse on the origins of inequality. In the state of nature, people do not have this amour propre. This is what he writes. Elsewhere, he says maybe they have it, but it's just not activated. Not important. So, or something like that. Doesn't matter. So in the state of nature, you have no amour propre. But then, as population increases and people are forced to live together, this feeling emerges. Specifically, he says, it emerges from us looking at one another. As people start living together, at some point they start looking at one another. And in addition to having feeling of happiness or satisfaction or unsatisfaction, you also have a feeling of esteem. Am I being respected? Am I being honored? This feeling does not exist in the state of nature. Like Rousseau would say, very plausibly, that your cat cannot be offended. You can hurt your cat, but you cannot offend your cat. It's not a question of like honor. These things, they appear at some point, and language is crucial, among other things, for the appearance of this emotion. Nietzsche and Freud would agree with Rousseau, and they would say that some sort of primitive pre-human condition, or maybe in early childhood, human beings only have consciousness without self-consciousness. So this is what Freud calls id. And then at some point, you have the appearance of language, and you have the appearance of not just consciousness, but also self-consciousness, linguistic self-consciousness. You don't just live a certain way, but you also describe in words your life in a certain way. And this is, well, I suppose this roughly corresponds to what Freud would call superego. Although superego is not exactly amour propre, but there's a relation between the two. Does this answer your question? Yeah. Approximately? Yeah, okay. But this is an important question, obviously. Yeah, so these things appear before. These things appear more or less simultaneously. These things appear more or less at the same time. And the most important consequence of all three simultaneously is inequality. And in some sense, all three are required for the emergence of inequality. So amour propre is our desire to be unequal. Notice, again, in terms of amour de soi, if I'm satisfied, you can be satisfied too. Your satisfaction does not detract from my satisfaction. I can be happy and you can be happy as well. But amour propre is not like this. Amour propre is this competitive desire to be honored above everybody else. There's only one number one. So if you are esteemed more, it means that I am esteemed less. We cannot all be respected at the same level for Rousseau. In the sense of amour propre. Because again, amour propre is this desire. We talked about this with respect to Hobbes last time. Some people want to have bronze or actually golden statues erected in their honor. Want other people to worship them, and there's limited capacity for that. There's this desire has fundamental scarcity, if you want, built into it, or something like that. Okay, so all this leads to inequality. So amour propre is a desire to be unequal. Corn and iron, so metallurgy and agriculture, allow people to become unequal. Because in the state of nature, like if you imagine a kind of hunter-gatherer society where you just stroll through the woods and gather, fruit from trees, how much inequality can actually exist? Okay, so you have 10 apples and I have 50 apples. But if I gather more than 50 apples, I will not be able to carry them, or something like that. It is agriculture which allows people to grow a lot of grain and store grain. Grain, unlike apples, can be stored for long periods of time. And metallurgy also allows you to acquire wealth in terms of gold or something like that. And maybe also metallurgy enables war. Enables war and enables people who have a lot of property to make swords to protect their property. So metallurgy and agriculture exacerbates, amplifies natural inequality. Technology, well, again, is technology bad? Is metallurgy and agriculture bad? In the state of nature, it's bad, you don't need it. In the bourgeois, for the bourgeois, technology is bad because it allows and sustains this inequality. For the true citizen, technology is going to be good. In a later point. So today we're going to talk about how metallurgy and agriculture can actually be good. But at this stage in human history, at this stage in Rousseau's story, metallurgy and agriculture are bad, technology is bad because it amplifies natural inequalities and leads to more misery and suffering for everybody. And property, same thing. If I want to be unequal, there has to be like property rights, some kind of property establishment, so that I can have more than you. Okay, so what this leads to in general, and notice again, in the state of nature, Rousseau says there is a limited natural compassion. And what Rousseau is saying actually makes a lot of sense. If I were to take a knife and in front of you, right now, cut myself open and splash warm blood all over your faces, you would not be pleased. This would not be a pleasant sight.
I would.
Well, every political philosopher always allows for some exceptions. But the vast majority of people will not be pleased. So in the same fashion, if you see kittens being tortured in the street, you feel natural pity. And so we have this natural, limited sentiment for compassion. But this sentiment gets silenced by amour propre. In the desire for glory, people forget about this. They have this desire, but this feeling, but they repress it. And the desire to pursue glory takes over that, silences that. Anyway, so the result of all this, of these three causes, amour propre, corn iron, and property, is situation of scarcity. And he says that some people just roam around in the woods, they don't do anything. And they used to be rich, and now they suddenly become poor. Why? Well, let's imagine because there's fertile land on which hunter-gatherers just roam, and then agricultural civilizations just come and push them out into less hospitable lands, into the desert or somewhere. And again, the consequence of all this is war. This is point number 4. War. War such as of every man against every man. And again, war due to scarcity. And war between rich and poor, but also rich and poor and poor. So basically, this is, say hi to Thomas Hobbes. This is the war of all against all. This is sort of before society. He says, if you have something, you're afraid it's going to be stolen. If you have nothing, you're trying to steal it from somebody else. And if you have nothing, you also compete against other people who have nothing because you're all trying to steal from somebody who has something. Because of scarcity, which appears at this stage. And again, it's very important for Rousseau that the miseries that people imagine, that people experience at this point in human history are worse than the miseries of the condition of the state of nature. And again, this is a potentially complicated discussion, but I think at least preliminarily what Rousseau says makes sense. If you actually look at wild animals usually do not suffer. Like, they are relatively moderately healthy. So, let's say, even stray cats in the streets of Moscow are relatively moderately healthy. Because if a cat becomes crippled or diseased, it dies very, very fast. It is only human society, like the horrors of the, concentration camps or something like that. It's hard to imagine in the state of nature. Because in the state of nature, if some calamity strikes, you just die. You will not be forced to live in perpetual, horrible slavery for the next 20 years. This is what society does artificially to human beings. Anyway, so we have this emergence of war, and this is the crucial point. So after the war appears, you have, at number 5, you have the emergence of the evil contract. Again, not a phrase that Rousseau uses, but again, the problem is that Rousseau talks about the social contract in 2 different works. The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality and on the True Social Contract. He uses exactly the same phrase. He doesn't use these adjectives. He doesn't say evil contract here. He doesn't say true social contract here. But he clearly means 2 very different things. So even though Rousseau doesn't have a term for the difference, he is clearly talking about different things. So this evil contract works like this. People are afraid to die, and out of fear of death, they submit. This is, again, Thomas Hobbes, 100%. With this exception, Hobbes thinks that it's a good, proper thing, and we should do this. Whereas Rousseau, especially in the social contract, he's going to say, well, if the people are forced to obey, and they do obey, what can you do? What can you do? Especially in the true social contract, he's not going to, on the social contract, he's not going to judge people. He says, yeah, you were forced on the pain of death, on the pain of fear of death, you were forced to conclude this evil contract. But in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, he says, in principle, if you could, you would be better off dead. And he says, savages will prefer to die fighting for their freedom rather than living on their knees. And he says that about people like Hobbes and Locke, only one thing I can say, it is not for slaves to discuss freedom. Rousseau is a very uncompromising thinker in this respect. Question?
Is this evil contract a direct consequence of war against the old?
Yes. So that you have this horrible condition in which people are afraid for their life, and that's why they're forced to unite together. And he says that this contract, this evil contract, it is a swindle. It is a lie perpetrated by the rich against the poor. That this evil, in principle, I think that Rousseau wants to say that everybody, including the bourgeois, including the rich, everybody is better off dead. State of nature was better. It's better to live in the state of nature than even to be a rich man in society. As far as I can tell. But still, within this limited sense, it is a lie told by the rich to the poor. What is the lie? The lie is that the social contract is in everybody's interest. That it is your free choice to live in society. And Rousseau says, no, in reality, this is a one-sided game. This is a con game, a swindle, that the rich perpetrate against the poor. Something like that. The rich get to legitimize their rights of property and inequality, and the poor get nothing. The poor are simply forced to live in horrible conditions. And again, Rousseau is, in some sense, again, in a fashion similar to maybe Freud or Nietzsche, especially Freud, would say that in some sense, natural man would never agree to live in such society. It is because we are broken by society. Like from the time that we are born, society breaks us through upbringing, through education, through our parents. Society breaks us and forces us to become these defective, degenerate humans who will be afraid to die and out of fear of death will agree to live in horrible conditions of servitude. Basically slavery. again, the analysis is very similar to Hobbes. In fact, if we look at the board, I think you will find no major disagreement between Hobbes and Rousseau by this point, including. Let me just signal this. This Rousseau's description of the state of nature is one of the key reasons I insist. And for Hobbes, even though the state of nature is real, he's not talking about historical condition. He's not talking about ancient past. He's talking about what happens now. And in this respect, Hobbes and Rousseau agree completely. Hobbes and Rousseau would both say that the present state of nature, what human beings by nature are now, is this. But Rousseau also, in addition to this, says, but in the ancient past, it used to be different. But also, very importantly, let me signal this up front. It's a crucially important picture. You cannot go back. For Rousseau, you cannot go back to the state of nature. It's impossible. For all sorts of reasons.
Poor, or if everybody becomes rich, then there is no scarcity. Functionally speaking.
Well, again, there is scarcity now, and you cannot go back to the state of nature because there's just not enough resources to support this free lifestyle. Not to mention that probably psychologically we were also broken. Now, if what you're saying, if we have technology and everybody's rich,
or everybody's poor.
Everybody's poor. No, everybody's poor, that won't do. Because in the state of nature, we weren't poor. There is no scarcity. There was no scarcity. No, I mean, yeah, if you say everybody's rich, that's called communism, that's called Karl Marx. Who is obviously looking at this picture as he's writing the Communist Manifesto. Yeah. But Rousseau lives before the Industrial Revolution. Rousseau doesn't imagine that this abundance is possible. Anyway, but Rousseau will have another solution. We'll talk about this in a second. And basically, Rousseau is saying this is horrible, but can it get worse? And the answer is yes, it can get it can get even worse. And this is point number 6. And this is international relations. He says that, yeah, wars. So this slavery within the country is pretty bad, but when countries fight with one another, horrors multiply beyond imagination. It gets even worse. So like imagine so the evil contract is bad because the rich oppress the poor. But international relations becomes even worse because you have this army comes into a foreign territory and just plunders and murders, and this is supposed to be glorious, a glorious conqueror, like Alexander the Great or something like, or Julius Caesar. But in fact, what you're doing is just genocide. Yeah, let me write the word genocide on the board. This is basically so if this is slavery, this is genocide. Unfortunately, I left myself no space, but I'm going to have to continue somehow. Question? Okay. So, probably the next point we want to talk about is what is the solution. So, again, 2 works. One is the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality ends here. Well, technically the last sentence is it's better to die fighting for your freedom than to live as a slave. This is where he ends the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. And then he leaves this subject, and for a number of years he doesn't come back to it, and at a later point he writes this book, different book called On the Social Contract. And it's similar and yet different in important respects. So let's talk about the social contract. The true social contract, right? So we have been talking, so basically, up until this point, we have been talking about this transition from the state of nature to the evil contract. And this transition is inevitable, and it happens to everybody for structural historical reasons. So now we ask this question, is there an alternative? And Rousseau imagines, this is important, that most people live here. So when Rousseau is going to talk about the general will in a second, remember, we are not talking about Jean-Jacques Stalin. We are talking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Okay? In fact, Rousseau explicitly says that most countries are here, and he does not approve of what they're doing. But, and here's where the discourse, here's where the second book on the social contract begins. He says, man is born free, yet everywhere he's in chains. How has this come about? Well, we know, this is the story. What can make it legitimate This is the answer that he will attempt to answer. This is the answer. This is the question that he will attempt to answer. So the question of the social contract is, what can make our chains legitimate? So how can you legitimize the chains? What are the proper legitimate ground for obedience, if you want? So, immediately, so we are going to talk about this hypothetical true social contract. Hypothetical in what sense? That maybe the best way to start thinking about this is in the following fashion. Rousseau is going to depict an idealized picture. He's perfectly clear that this doesn't happen very often. This doesn't happen in most places. He says on the social contract, it will be found upon close examination that most countries do not have laws. They live like lawless tyranny, something like that. Which is probably what he would say if you look outside the window right now. This is not a country ruled by laws. This is a lawless tyranny in which slaves are forced into obedience by the fear of death. This is going to be his description. So let me signal again. So it's a hypothetical device in the sense that only in some rare idealized circumstances it is possible to achieve this true social contract. But it is possible. It is possible. It is realizable, at least in some approximation. And the examples that he will give are, again, Republican Rome and Sparta. Are there other examples I'm forgetting? Well, I'm sure that there are possibly some other examples, but in general, these are the ones. Geneva. Well, he does idealize Geneva and say, peasants deliberating under an oak tree. Well, it's possible, and it's possible to be realized in the future. Rousseau actually wrote drafts for two constitutions, Constitution of Corsica and Constitution of Poland. So he imagines that both of these countries, though not true social contracts at his time, he imagined that they could become true social contracts in the future. Question?
Greece.
Greece. You don't know your history. Sparta. Obviously, Sparta, Greece, right? Greece is not a country in the ancient world. I mean, Greece is not a country in Rousseau's own day as well. Greece is a province of the Ottoman Empire in Rousseau's time. So, but among the ancient peoples, he will talk about Sparta. Athens, maybe to some extent with a question mark, but not really. Sparta is better than Athens for as far as Rousseau is concerned. Anyway, so again, very importantly, at the very beginning on the social contract, Rousseau says that the picture that he's going to give is going to unite rights with it says justice with utility, rights with interest. So rights, interest, justice, utility. So in a deep sense, the basis of this true social contract is commonality of interest. Rousseau says the difference of interest makes society necessary, commonality of interest makes society possible. So the difference of interest makes society necessary, commonality of interest makes society possible. So again, and he uses the word utility. If you want to see Rousseau as a proto-utilitarian with care, you can do so. He's not a utilitarian in a straightforward sense, but he's closer to utilitarianism than, for example, Immanuel Kant. Even though Kant will take his idea of the categorical imperative from Rousseau's notion of the general will. Anyway, so how is this supposed to work? Well, the way this is supposed to work is again. So you have the true social contract, and he says that the formulation of the social contract goes like this: the task of the social contract is to find the true social contract, right? Is to find a form of association which will defend and protect the person and property of each associate with the full common force, which will protect person, so life and property. And by means of this association, each uniting with all, nevertheless obeys only himself and remains as free as before. So each, uniting with all, nevertheless obeys only himself and remains as free as before. So let me just write this on the word: obey and free. So you obey the laws of society, but you obey them freely. Freedom is obedience. Is this Orwell, 1984? No. We need to explain this. And I suppose, immediately, let's write this on the board, the most important word. Voluntarily right? The general will. And let me immediately signal this to you. I think that the correct reading of the general will is that the general will is not society's general will. General will is your general will. Notice, we are talking about common interest. Common interest. So obviously, common interest, to the extent that it's common, is the same for all. But it's my common interest. It's my common interest which is common to your common interest. In the same way, the general will is common to all, but it's my general will, which is the same as your general will. So, I don't know, in some sense, if I want to draw this, if I could draw this on the board, if you imagine different people, and these would be the spheres of our interests, there would be, let's say, a common part, an interest which is common to all, and then there would be individual differences, right? Rousseau says that the basis of the social contract is common interest, things that we have in common. Now, immediately, what we're going to get to at the end is that, similarly to Hobbes, though not exactly, the true social contract provides security, but also provides space for freedom. Greater space for freedom than the bourgeois freedom. So, at the end of the day, it is in the interest of the individual to be a member of society. Again, if you think about this, a child left in the forest is not free in any meaningful sense of the word. In order to realize your freedom, you need to be enabled by society. Society does not so much restrict me. The true social contract does not so much restrict me, but enables my freedom. Sometimes people classify this by talking about positive freedom and negative freedom. Maybe. I mean, there are problems with these terms, but in general, yes, this is positive versus negative freedom. So, in a sense that, again, negative freedom is something that you can see very clearly in the evil contract. In the evil contract, society is evil. You want to have as little as possible to do with society. So, to the extent that society leaves you alone, you are free. This is negative freedom. Freedom from society. Freedom from society. Rousseau says, this is not true freedom. It's impossible to be free if your freedom is negative freedom. The only freedom worthy of a human being is positive freedom, when you are free through society. So, again, some conception. Imagine some conception of a human being. Like, what do you want to do with your life? What is the reason you wake up in the morning and don't just kill yourself or something? Well, let's suppose I want to be a philosophy professor. Well, does society hinder me or enable me in my pursuit? Well, in the ideal circumstance, in the true social contract, society enables me. There are people who have born me and brought me up, fed me while I was a child. Then there are teachers who have educated me, police which has protected me, and now the university which gives me a position, which provides textbooks, etc., etc. They do not restrict, they enable my freedom. My ambition to become a philosophy professor, or let's say my ambition to do philosophy in general, is enabled by other people. I am enabled by people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or by George Klosko, or by Plato and Aristotle, because they contribute to the development, unraveling, expression of my freedom. We'll talk about this more maybe at some point, but it's kind of important to keep this in mind at this stage. So, again, let me give you a very concrete example of what the general will is. The general will is as follows. And again, I always have to keep saying that the general will only exists in the true social contract. You don't have the general will in the evil contract. Well, again, in some sense, in the evil contract, the general will is for everybody to just kill themselves. Because it's better to die fighting for your freedom than to live as a bourgeois. For Rousseau. Anyway, so, well, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I'm sometimes tempted to get a bit too controversial, but I think that the productive way to use Rousseau when you look outside the window is to say this is an idealized model, and maybe it's like a Weberian ideal type. And society in which we find ourselves is a combination of the two ideal types, of the ideal type of true evil contract and true social contract. And in this sense, again, Rousseau is not Stalin, and Rousseau is not just an ideal. This is not a utopia. This is not a utopia. This is a useful analytic device. This is like a gold standard against which you compare existing societies. And you say, some societies are better, some societies are worse at this. If your society is not completely perfect, still life may be... Because I suppose on the way from the evil contract to the true social contract, there are degrees, and there is space above the point zero, where life is palatable. Anyway, so let me give you a concrete example. Well, by the way, lest I forget, remind me, we need to talk about 4, maybe 5 conditions for the true social contract. Because Rousseau says not every society can have the true social contract. You need certain conditions need to be met. We'll talk about this in a second. Anyway, so let me give you my example. Let me start with a simple example, and then we'll talk about a more complicated example. How can obedience be free? The best example I could have come up with is this. Driving in the streets of Moscow. Extreme activity, not for the faint of heart, right? Some of you may already have a driver's license. Most of you probably will get a driver's license at some point. So when I drive, most of the time, I obey traffic laws. Okay, immediately you can say, yeah, but sometimes people break traffic laws. Yeah, bracket those cases out. Okay, forget about those cases. So, like if your loved one, if your beloved cat is dying and you have to rush it to the hospital, you break the laws. Whatever. Let's not talk about these examples. Let's talk about the standard case. The standard case in which most people obey traffic laws. So when I drive, most of the time I obey the traffic laws. Now, why do I do this? And again, you have 2 potential answers. One is evil contract. I am afraid that the policeman will catch me. Or the true social contract. I freely choose to obey them. How does this work? How can free obedience work? In the following way. So I'm driving on a highway, and let's say if I decide to drive in the wrong lane, I have a very high chance of dying in a gruesome, spectacular accident and my blood splashing in fountains all around the pavement. So I don't want to do that. It is in my interest to obey the traffic laws. So, and in this sense, like when I stop at the red light, I do this because I obey the traffic laws, but I do this freely because it is in my rational self-interest to do so. So yes, I obey, but I obey freely. Kind of at the same time, I obey and I am free. And this is how order is possible at the end. Because people are free, yet their behavior is predictable and regular because they rationally choose to obey the rules. Again, let me rephrase this in a different fashion. If I am rational and the laws are rational, I ask myself, what do I want to do? And I come up with a certain strategy. And then I look at the laws, and the laws suggest exactly the same strategy. So in some sense, even if there were no laws, I would still obey them because it is my rational self-interest. It's free obedience. Or like imagine a doctor prescribes medication to you. And you take medication, not because your doctor commands you on the pain of death and doctor will punish you if you don't take medication. No, you want to get well. So it is in your rational self-interest to obey the doctor. Free obedience. This is not Stalin. Not Stalin. It's very important. It has to be in your real self-interest. Again, another example, weird example. A child wants to poke its eye out with a screwdriver. And the parents take away the screwdriver. What are the parents doing? Well, Rousseau will say, the parents are forcing the child to be free. Force to be free. Again, it's a sinister sounding phrase, but this has nothing to do with totalitarianism. Again, there is a difference between forcing somebody and forcing them to be free. Forcing is not forcing to be free. Forcing to be free is when a person does something clearly irrational because they're mad or a child or have made a mistake. So, like, mad, child, or mistake. But under normal circumstances, Like if a person is not mad, another child not making a mistake, you cannot force somebody to be free because they are already free. So again, these are less controversial examples. Especially think of this example with a child and a screwdriver, or think of a different example. A child sees a bottle of bleach. It's wonderful and colorful or rainbowy, and the child will say, take a sip of bleach. And the parents are taking away bleach from the child, forcing the child to be free. Yes, restricting the child, but not in this evil contract fashion. But actually, this act of taking bleach away from the child is not violation of negative freedom. No, it's actually an expression of positive freedom. So this restriction will actually enable the child to be free in the future. If the child unknowingly drinks bleach and dies, it's not really free. It's not meaningful freedom. Not everything you do freely. Again, Rousseau has the technical term for this. He says that obedience to appetite is slavery, and true freedom is obedience to the law that one has prescribed to oneself. So, obedience to appetite is slavery. To appetite, to instinct is slavery. And the only freedom worthy of a human being consists of obedience to the law that you have prescribed to yourself. Obedience to the law that you have prescribed to yourself. Again, like, let's imagine you're taking a regimen of medicine, or you're trying to go on a diet, or you're trying to stick with the exercise regime, right? You have prescribed to yourself, I know this is the best for me, I should do it. And if your appetites get the better of you, and you eat a chocolate cake in one sitting or something like that, and you immediately regret it, this is not freedom for Rousseau. The child wanting to drink bleach is also not freedom for Rousseau. Anyway, so let me get to the controversial example. The controversial example is this. I am a murderer. I killed somebody. So I stand up in court. And what is supposed to happen at this point? Well, Rousseau says, I have my particular will and I have my general will. Notice, both of these things are mine. So I have a particular will and a general will. Maybe I can erase something. Let's erase this. So my particular will says, I don't want to go to prison. That's why I want the jury to be stupid, to be corrupt, and I want the jury to acquit me. So again, as a murderer, my particular will says, I particularly want to be acquitted. I want to get away with murder. But then I ask myself, notice, I'm not asking Stalin, I'm asking myself. Generally speaking, what do I think should be done with people like me? Do I want to live, and notice, want, we're talking about common interest. We're talking about interest, right? Utility. Do I want, would I find it nice to live in a society where people are allowed to get away with murder? And so I have an internal conflict within me. My particular will says, jury, please acquit me. But my general will says, anybody who murders has to be punished. So particular will applies to my particular case. So basically, I want an exception. But the general will says, no, as a general rule, anybody who murders has to be punished. So in some sense, if I am rational, I want the jury to punish me. I am punishing myself. Which is why when the criminal is justly punished, he or she is being forced to be free, for Rousseau, in a similar fashion. So go from this drinking bleach to punishing criminals. For Rousseau, these examples are analogous. In the same fashion that it is irrational for a child to drink bleach, in exactly the same fashion, it is irrational for a murderer to want to get away with murder. As a murderer, and notice, if you actually look at courtroom dramas, if you actually look at how people behave in courts, usually you have one of the two scenarios. One scenario, people say, yes, murdering is wrong, and anybody who murders has to go to prison, but I haven't done it. There's a mistake. I'm being framed. So please do not send me to prison because I haven't actually done this. This is one possible line of argument. Another possible line of argument is, yes, I have murdered. I am guilty. I am very sorry. Please go easy on me. And actually, if you actually switch on the television, if you actually, or read the newspapers, if you see how criminals behave, usually it's one of the two. What is the alternative? The alternative is this. And think about it. Can you find any examples? I'm sure you can find examples. These will be very few. Only deranged psychopaths would say this in court. You know what? I murdered. Yes, I killed the guy. And you know what? I think anybody who wants to murder should be allowed to murder. And I'm fine with that. And fuck your laws, fuck your society, and fuck you.
I agree.
No. It's a dramatic statement, but think about this. So, do criminals behave like that? Can you find examples? Very, very rarely. Again, deranged psychopaths, Ted Bundy, maybe they would do this. But in general, criminals do not do this. And which is a vindication of Rousseau's point, which is a vindication that even in our imperfect society, people understand this. And notice, it is the conscience of the criminal who accuses him. As a criminal, I say, yes, I have done something wrong. Notice, if you say, fuck your laws and fuck your society, you are setting yourself apart from this common rule of reason, right? And Rousseau says, if that's your tack, if that's your position, do you go live in the forest? What's your life going to be like that? So again, we are enabled by society, not or at least under normal circumstances, not restricted by it. Okay. So I'm not sure. I feel that this dramatic example might have confused people a little bit. But again, the point is that the general will is my general will. I hope this is perfectly clear. Again, and when I'm being forced to be free, actually I'm being forced to comply with what my conscience already tells me is right. And even though part of me, my appetites, say, yeah, but please make an exception for me, I also rationally realize that a good, well-functioning society should not make exceptions for people like me. Because if we make exceptions, then the rules break down, and we go back to the Hobbesian war of all against all, and that's not in my interest. Okay, so let's talk about conditions. So,
But that could make sure that this conflict of one guilty of whether he's right or wrong and following the rationale or following the appetite is like who is the one who is going to be deciding the norm and so on.
Yeah.
Basically, who's
The sovereign. Yeah, you said basically who's the sovereign. Yeah. Sovereign is people in their collective capacity. So if we all decide that this is something like this. Well, again, the true social contract is based on the commonality of interest of all. If some people are psychopaths and they have no common interest with us, then they cannot be part of our society. And in some sense, when you punish psychopaths, you cannot accuse them of morally. You don't accuse them of being immoral. You accuse them of being inhuman. Or let's say, saying that they're immoral actually means that they're inhuman. Something like that. Anyway, maybe that's a confusing point, but still. Hobbes also has a rudiment of this point, even though at the end of the day, Hobbes is especially supportive of regimes such as monarchy, where the sovereign is one person, instantiated one person. Rousseau is not exactly like that. Rousseau agrees with the earlier formulations of Hobbes in the Elements of Law that sovereignty always has to belong to all people in their collective capacity. For Hobbes, it's sort of like that as well, because remember, the sovereign is the sovereign only because everybody agrees that they are the sovereign, the individual. But Rousseau doesn't want to take the second step. He wants to say, because everybody has to confer power at the same time, this power cannot be delegated, cannot be alienated. The sovereignty always lies with people in their collective capacity. Sovereignty always lies with the people in their collective capacity.
So we all have a little bit of power, and we all have to make sure that we watch each other of following the rules.
Short answer, yes. Longer answer, we'll talk about this in a second, because this doesn't actually take too much time to explain. Anyway, let's talk about the conditions. So the conditions that we're talking about are actually wonderful question. How can we do this? How can we ensure that the laws are just? Rousseau says your society has to be small. If your society is too large, you will not be able to make sure, again, like everybody will not be able to be in touch with everybody else to make sure that the laws are just. So the second is that we have to be approximately equal, approximate economic equality. Because if you have factions of extremely rich and extremely poor, they will not really have general will. You will have two competing factions which all have both of their, what's the word that he uses? So, particular will, general will, and between we have corporate? Corporate. What is the word that he uses? Anyway, approximate economic equality, because again, because between people who are very rich and very poor, there can be no commonality of interest, or at least there's too little common ground. And he says also very importantly, and let's keep this idea in mind. This is going to be an important idea for the future. Rousseau says, look, my rights are protected by you. So it is in my interest that you are not too poor. Because if you are so poor that your votes can be bought by somebody, that you are forced to sell your vote for bread, basically, then democracy is impossible. Or any kind, well, let's not talk about democracy, republic. Republic is impossible. The true social contract is impossible. So this issue, for both Rousseau and for Marx, this issue of providing for basic necessities, it's not like I am being forced by society to pay taxes to these horrible poor and horrible lazy poor. No. Both Rousseau and Marx are going to say, I want to pay taxes. I want you to be relatively, not completely poor, and I want you to be, let's say, educated, etc., because you will be the guarantee of my rights. So again, number 3, similar, no factions or too many factions. No factions in the sense that, let's say, if half of your country is Catholic, half of your country is Protestant, same thing again. The common ground gets eroded. Or there has to be so many factions that no faction is particularly strong. So factions, religious factions, ideological factions, whatever. Subdivisions in society. And number 4, we're talking about relative autonomy of the state, right? This is what we're talking about. These are the 4. Relative autonomy in the sense that you do not depend on a foreign power militarily or economically. So relative economic self-sufficiency. So Rousseau thinks that only in these circumstances can you really have the general will. And again, he says most countries, like France of his day, is not going to be true social contract. Okay, let me signal. We don't have a lot of time, but let me signal 2 things before I let you go. So first is this transition from the evil contract to the true social contract is problematic. Rousseau says, in order to effect this transition, you need to change human nature. Because these selfish bourgeois will not be able to get together and form social contract. Even if they know what the general will is, they will still be led by their particular wills. So he says that in order to effect this transition, you need a miracle. I'm not joking. He actually uses this word, miracle. And this miracle is what he calls Lawgiver. Lawgiver is this non-political, charismatic figure. It's very important. The lawgiver does not have legal power. Lawgiver is this charismatic, prophetic figure who, through the force of his charisma, can reshape human nature. Rousseau will give examples, like Lycurgus, the founder of Sparta, Romulus, the founder of Rome, but also Moses, we see, but also Muhammad. And it's also, even though Rousseau doesn't come out and say this, it's also very clear that Rousseau thinks that he himself, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, is also another lawgiver. It's an individual who has miraculous powers to change human nature. Change human nature in the sense that to enable people to see their common interest. This is not an answer, okay? This is a hole in Rousseau's story. Later on, we'll talk about in Hegel and Marx. Hegel and Marx are going to say it's not a miracle; it's logic of historical process. So both Hegel and Marx will attempt to answer this question of how is this miracle possible, and they will say there are certain structural ways in which this happens. Last thing I want to say, even though maybe this is a little bit confusing, but whatever. Last thing I want to say is I want to talk about the government for Rousseau. So even though in general, we are talking about these small autonomous states, so every state that has a true social contract, Rousseau is willing to go republic. And in a republic, in a true social contract, right? True social contract, the power, the plenitude of power, always belongs to the people in their collective capacity. Always belongs to the people in their collective capacity. But then what happens is that people, explicitly or tacitly, this is very important, explicitly or tacitly, people, first of all, make the laws, and secondly, they appoint the government. So, what do I mean explicitly or tacitly? Like Lycurgus proposes laws to the Spartans. Lycur предлагает законы спартанцам. But he does not have power, he cannot legislate. They listen to him, and they maybe silently or maybe explicitly agree. But the laws, even if they are pronounced by one person, have to be ratified by people in their collective capacity. And notice, again, by the definition of the general will is common to all. So there has to be, in principle, in a perfect social contract, there will always be unanimous agreement on all the laws. There will always be unanimous agreement on all the laws. And so, in this sense, every society is a direct participatory democracy in a legislative sense. But only in the legislative sense. But notice, I say direct participatory democracy, but it could be a monarch. Monarch proposes the laws, and everybody silently agrees. But very important, they have to be free to voice their disagreement. It's important. But if everybody silently agrees, yeah, that's fine. But in terms of and the laws reflect the general will. But the government, the enforcing of the laws, the executive branch, is different. The executive branch has to look at the laws and apply them. The general will always applies to all the cases, and then you have to apply them to specific particular cases. And here, Rousseau says, you can have a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a democracy. And basically, so again, a monarchy can be a republic. A monarchy can be a republic. So the laws are made by the consent of all the people, and then the monarch is the chief executive officer of the laws of the people. You understand the difference? So, from the standpoint of law, we are some kind of maybe a tacit democracy, but from the standpoint of executive branch, we can have a monarchy. Our regime most closely resembles what Rousseau calls elective aristocracy. Elective aristocracy. So a few people are elected by the majority, and this is what he calls basically to enforce the laws. And this is elective aristocracy. Democracy is ancient Athens, where you have lottery, appointment to individual positions by lot, such that basically every citizen is at the same time actually or potentially a magistrate. This is nothing like what we call democracy today. So this is going back to your question. Who basically, like, jury reaches a verdict in a court trial? Who makes sure that the decision of the jury is in line with the general will? Basically, this structure. And as long as your country is small, approximately equal, there's no faction, and there's relative autonomy from the outside world, you're going to be fine. But again, very importantly, this is an idealized model. Most societies are not like that. Very few societies are like that, but probably not perfectly. Because Rousseau will say, Sparta is an example of this. Is it a perfect example? Probably not. So this is more like an ideal to which you strive. More like a normative ideal to which you compare actually existing societies. So again, this is not Stalin. I have to keep repeating that. Am I forgetting anything crucially important? Okay. Yeah.
So big states have no chances at all.
For Rousseau, no. But Hegel is going to come next Wednesday, and he's going to say, actually, I'm going to tell you a story about how this is possible in big states, but you have to like do additional work. You have to say, so because in principle, Rousseau says that these are the conditions because they do something. These like if these conditions are not met, you run into problems which Rousseau thinks cannot be solved. But if you find some mechanism to solve these problems, like Hegel, then okay, your state can be big or whatever. Okay, people. I understand this is a lot of stuff, but this is the basics of Rousseau. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer. Otherwise, thank you so much. I'll see you after the break. We'll talk about milk.